everybody, welcome back to Workshop Quick Takes. Today on Basic Auto, we are tackling the valve cover gasket on a 2000 Jeep Cherokee XJ with the inline-6 engine. Valve cover gaskets, or sometimes it's also a cam cover gasket if you have an overhead cam engine, are a common failure point over time, and it's subject to heat, it's subject to vibration, and then oil starts to seep down the side of the engine. That oil can collect dirt and make things run hotter. It can also start to pool or collect on areas that are not oil rated, such as, for example, cooling system hoses really don't like oil. It's not an emergency if you see it happening. It does need to be done though. Our demo vehicle today is a fairly easy one to tackle. Everything's right on top of the engine, easy to get to, not a lot of stuff to move out of the way. May not be true on whatever vehicle you're working on, so gauge your experience level before tackling this. Just keep in mind, you need to be able to access and remove that valve or cam cover in such a way that you don't knock dirt and crud down in the engine while you're working. Especially if you happen to drop a socket or a other piece of tooling down into a coolant or oil passage, that must be fished out either by you using a magnet or whatever you can do, or by a mechanic, very important here, before starting the engine. Don't start the engine if there's anything that's fallen down into it. You could ruin it. The other thing to keep in mind is you're going to be moving a lot of rubber and plastic pieces out of the way, hoses, clips, whatever, in order to access that cover typically. And when you do so, some of those are going to break. On today's vehicle, a couple areas of note is that there is a PCV valve, which is also a failure-prone part over time, a breather tube, and a couple of related hoses and grommets mounted right on top of the cam cover. Save yourself some trouble. When you see parts and pieces like that before starting the job, just go buy them at the auto parts store. It's probably only another 20 or 30 bucks in some cases, and you're probably going to break at least one of them anyway. So, gauge your experience level, but don't be afraid of it. It's a fairly straightforward job to do, as we're going to show today. Let's go take a look at the project vehicle. All right, let's find out how much trouble I can get myself into in 1 hour. Okay, I have here a cam cover gasket that needs to be replaced. It's been leaking a lot of oil, and I just recently took it to the car wash, so I want to get it done before it starts seeping too badly again. Bolts on some sides, studs on the other. The only thing I think I have to remove on this one is there's a little harness sitting on top of one, and then of course the electrical rail here. And actually, this one here is mounted on the head bolts, but it may get in the way. Looks like I also need to disconnect the throttle control bracket just to lift that up and out. And then, of course, there's a couple holes here on the PCV valves. So, let's start with these. Yeah, I'm going to need a new grommet there too, I think. There we go. And of course it did. That's okay though, I can rejoin that with a piece of hose. Tentatively, I need a 10mm socket for all these. These shouldn't have a tremendous amount of torque on them. Let's try starting with a smaller ratchet and see where that goes. No, those must be 11s. How about these guys over here? These are 10s. One bolt for the throttle control rail, and 2 bolts for the throttle control rail. It looks like these all pop off of their respective throttle points there. I just need a flat edge screwdriver and a gentle hand. So that rail's loose. Just need to remove 3 throttle cables. That one's easy. These plastic ones are going to be a little bit troublesome, I think. They pop off this way. There we go. Always look for another way of doing it before getting too violent and forceful. And this here is just very gently popped onto those. So I lift that off. And then this bracket comes all the way around. What do I want to do with this? Do I want to try and pop it out of there? I feel like it's not too much trouble. Okay. Fair and fine then. I want this one out of the way because it loops around. And just to double check, make sure I'm not going to have anything flop back over on my battery terminal since I haven't disconnected that. Got a couple of hoses here that are kind of in the way, but I think I can work around them. Pretty messy back there. This engine is tilted back slightly, so all the oil that collects runs down back there and kind of accumulates. Okay, so these here were not 10s. They seem to be 11s or 12s. 11 it is. And there's why it's leaking. There's no torque on these at all. Okay, later I'm going to have to go arrange these in a sensible way so I can put them back in. So I need to remember them starting from bottom right. The other question I have, given how loose these are, is whether the aluminum spacers were kept or not. Okay, and these need a long socket. Yeah, so some of these have been mashed right through the plastic spacers. Let's pause here for a moment and explain what was really going on. This particular engine uses a stamped steel valve cover mounted on a cast iron head. Because the steel cover is more flexible than the head, a rigid seal would tend to leak from normal thermal expansion and shifting. So instead, this design relies on a combination of a flexible siliconized gasket at the mating surface and rubber isolation grommets on the mounting bolts. Correctly installed, the cover is permitted to flex slightly without losing its sealing surface. The grommets eventually become hard and brittle, so our replacement gasket includes a new set. What the replacement gasket does not include are the metal spacers that live inside the grommets. Forget to transfer these spacers, and the cover will never torque down correctly. Being an old SAE design, this engine's valve cover bolts use a 1/4 20 thread, and that means we have a large selection of possible options at our local Ace Hardware. Spacers were investigated, and one type was located that was just about the right diameter, but a bit too long. Rather than buy enough for the entire cover and file them down, we tried something else: T-nuts. These just happen to have two useful properties. The cap nearly covers the entire grommet, providing stability, and the shank is just long enough to substitute for the missing spacers. They weren't designed for this application, but just happened to be a nearly perfect fit. Of course, there's two popular types of T-nuts, and one type has little spikies coming off of the perimeter in order to be pounded into wood or other soft surface. Fortunately, by shopping at Ace, we were able to get a different set that's designed to mount on top of metal or other hard surface using miniature screws. We also picked up extra washers just in case we needed to change the spacer depth by stacking them on, but fortunately those were unnecessary. Yeah, look at that. There's a Velcro under there too. Or something similar. Someone put that on, they didn't have the spacers, and so this thing wouldn't tighten up the way it was supposed to. Oh, do I really have to remove that core ground bolt back there? Almost looks like I might. Nope, I don't. Just have to get around it. There we go. Yeah, look at that. Push the plastic piece right through and off. Mineral spirits, or white spirit in UK parlance, is a good solvent for cleaning parts such as our sludge-up cam cover bolts. White gasoline, also known as Coleman camping fuel in the US, is also a good option. Both require ventilation, but are a lot less likely to flash over into a raging fireball compared to pump gasoline. Also, they stink less. While we've got the cam cover removed, we should clean any sludge hiding under the splash shield, which is a part that prevents oil from being thrown by the rockers into the PCV valve, vent, and filler hole on top of the cam cover. The splash shield can trap sludge, but it's rather nice to have. I once tried adding oil to a running Toyota 4AGE engine which had no splash shield and an overhead cam. That's a mistake you only make once. There are two alignment pins on this gasket, otherwise it just lifts off. Not in terrible shape either. It could probably be cleaned and reused, but I'd prefer not. What we can do though is be 100% certain we got the correct one in our new kit. Looks like.
Oh, that was a close one. There's part of another gasket there. I wasn't paying attention. That could have ended up in the engine.
At first I thought I was cleaning oil residue only, but it turned out there were remnants of a fiber-type gasket with RTV silicone still sticking to the head surface. If material like that isn't removed when a gasket is changed, there's a very good chance the new one will not seal properly.
I need to be wiping outward away so that I'm not pushing sludge and other crud in there. Looks like I got some carbonized oil over here that I'm gonna have to scrape off. Probably a brass bristle brush so that I don't create metal filings.
In case it isn't obvious by now, prep work almost always takes more time than the actual job. That's true for painting, it's true for welding in many cases, and it's definitely true when replacing gaskets. Now, it may be tempting to try and take shortcuts and just get the job done, but you'll be doing it again and again and again as each repair fails if you don't take time to clean things properly. We had to make a parts run that delayed completion until evening, and put the cam cover loosely back in place to protect the engine innards. Once we returned to the engine bay, our next step was to make sure the mating surfaces for the seal were still nice and clean on both sides. Next, we installed the replacement valve cover gasket. If this were a fiber type unit or a form-in-place gasket maker assembly, an appropriate tube of black silicone would have been in order. But this siliconized metal gasket is simply placed into position. There are a pair of alignment pins on the top of the head that ensure the seal only goes in one way and stays in position while the cover is reinstalled. This would be particularly fidgety if the gasket was using a tube of silicone, but for this engine, the pinned metal gasket will hold position while the cover is worked back in place, so long as it isn't roughed up too much.
Resist temptation.
The valve cover bolts, T-locks, and replacement rubber grommets were pre-assembled indoors earlier in the day. Each one is now given a quick spritz of a spray-on metal protector, which is supposed to leave a film that excludes moisture and protects from corrosion without overly lubricating the bolt. Initially, we install a few bolts randomly around the perimeter to secure the cover in place, but these are not fully torqued yet. Both the initial tightening and final torquing need to be done from the center of the cover outwards to the ends, similar to how an engine head is typically mounted on the block. That method minimizes the risk of one mating surface being cross-tensioned end to end, which could result in warping and premature seal failure. Once everything is tightened firmly, the bolts must be torqued to spec, again from the center outward. The manufacturer's specified torque rating is somewhere around 70 to 80 inch-pounds or 6 to 7 pound-feet. We think that works out to around 8 Newton meters, but since this engine's core bits were designed to SAE Imperial specs and never updated during its 2-decade manufacturing run, it probably has no idea what a Newton meter might look like. Alright everybody, not too bad once we got into it. Did have to make a parts run midway through, so as we showed on the video, if that happens to you, make sure you put the cover back in place or cover it up with plastic or whatever so you don't have leaves and wind and dirt and whatever else blowing into your engine between the job sessions. Other than that, fairly straightforward, and in spite of the fact that we had to make a custom modification on those bolt spacers, it hasn't leaked in 6 months, so seems to have worked. Thanks, see you again next time. Has anyone seen my phone?